Okay, so we're going to continue the marine biology theme and talk about cone snails, specifically cone snail venom. The other day I was watching a TED talk from this marine biologist that studied photosynthetic sea slugs. So I thought to myself, oh wow, that's a really cool video idea. As I was watching it, outside of being blown away by how crazy the ocean is with all the crazy cool animals, he spoke about cone snails very briefly, and I thought that was a really interesting topic, so I decided to do some research on it and make a video. So let's get into it. So what are cone snails? Well, they are extremely venomous sea snails. You can find them in warm tropical seas. I live in South Florida, and so I found that there are some species that live in my area. And sometimes you'll find people that have these assortments of beautiful shells, and I find out, well, those are cone snail shells. They are incredibly diverse as a species, thousands of different kinds in various colors, shapes, and patterns. I mean, if you go online, it's a beautiful assortment of all these cool looking venomous sea snails. They have this harpoon-like barb that they use to immobilize and eat their prey. So they will strike their prey, immobilize it, and then they kind of mosey on over to eat it. They are very slow, and so they need this very potent venom to kill what they're trying to eat. So in the wild, they are carnivores. They eat small fish, worms, mollusks, other cone snails. Their toxins are neurotoxins. Now, I have talked about neurotoxins a lot in my videos, but these are really interesting. I'm going to talk about why in a second. Now, there are a few that are deadly to humans, like Conus geographus, Conus tulipa, Conus striatus. These, I think, are a little bigger, and they can kill human beings. There hasn't been a lot of deaths, but these toxins are very, very potent. We're going to talk about why they are. So as far as anatomy real quick, so they have this thing, this siphon that they get water from to survive, and then this is the barb. It kind of shoots out, and I believe it either strikes their prey or sprays their venom into the water. So let's talk about this venom for the rest of the video. So let's talk about conotoxins. Conotoxin is the general catch-all term for this incredibly diverse range of what are called peptides. Peptides are very short chains of amino acids. These are molecules, these structures that are the building blocks of proteins. Peptides have a wide variety of uses. They can be used from things like skincare to medicine. Now, these peptides are interesting in that they are these incredibly potent methods of immobilizing prey. So these peptides have, some disulfide bonds. And these bonds contribute towards things like function, structure, and molecular stability. What's really interesting about these peptides is that each snail has hundreds to thousands of these things. Vast majority are not known whatsoever, but there are a few that have been studied, like alpha, gamma, kappa, I believe, mu, and omega. There's a paper I'm going to put in the description that I think does a really good job of discussing the amazing potential for conotoxins, and that's really where I'm getting most of this video from. I think it's a pretty easy to read paper. It's not crazy complex. It does get a little detailed, but I think it's pretty easy to understand. So there's so many therapeutic potentials for conotoxins. The paper discussed the ideal analgesic. Analgesics are compounds that reduce pain. So this thing would reduce pain while allowing for proper sensation, awareness, conscious awareness, and motor function. A lot of very strong pain relievers will dampen the consciousness, the focus, and will just kind of mess you up. You're not really able to function well. The ideal pain reliever would allow you to function well while relieving the pain. So there's a few we're going to talk about. Only two we'll talk about in detail. What's important about these is that these are non-opioid pain pathways. I previously posted a video on fentanyl, how this is a synthetic opioid, and I talked about how the opioid pathway is good in that it relieves pain, but it also produces things like addiction and stuff like that. What's important is that when you have chemicals or medications that relieve pain without the opioid pathway, then you're opening up the door for all kinds of useful medications that are not addictive and still offer great pain relief. So the first one is Ziconotide. Ziconotide is FDA approved. We're going to talk about that in a second. It is an N-type calcium channel blocker. We're going to get into that. Contulocin G is a neurotensin receptor 1 and receptor 2 molecule. We'll talk about that. VC1.1, RGIA, our alpha 9, alpha 10, nicotinic acetylcholine receptor antagonist. All that means is that these molecules go against these types of receptors. They stop them from working essentially. And then MRIA, I think that's what it was, is a neuroepinephrine transporter, a NET transporter. So like I said, I'm not going to get into especially these last two. That's a little beyond the scope of the video. If you do read the paper, I think they explain it pretty well. So if you want to get deep into that, please read the paper. I think it's a good resource for the topic of this video. So conotoxin G and neurotensin. So conotoxin G is a synthesized molecule from the venom of Conus geographus, and it mirrors neurotensin. When I say that, it operates in the same pathway. So both are peptides. Neurotensin is a neurotransmitter in the brain and a hormone in the gut. It does a lot of interesting things. It had a lot of functions. If you want to look into it, you'll see a whole list of functions that it has. Now, this molecule is distributed in the pain circuits, the neurons, the nerves that distribute pain signals. Now, conotoxin G can be an anti-nociceptive agent, which means it just produces pain relief. But again, importantly, it is a non-opioid pathway. Now, conotoxin G, I think from what the paper said, it didn't make it past all the trials. There's a lot of issues with side effects and all kinds of stuff, but there is a lot of potential for this and molecules like it. Now, this is a nicotinic acetylcholine receptor agonist. In my other videos, I've talked about acetylcholine, how it moves out from nerves to help relay a message, either for muscle function, in this case for pain, and this is an antagonist. It acts against that message to block the pain signals. And these are the structures for conotoxin G and neurotensin. So next we're going to talk about Ziconotide. Now, Ziconotide is FDA approved. We're going to discuss the pros and cons of that in a second. But Ziconotide is an N-type calcium channel blocker. There are a few types of calcium channels. In another video, I discussed electrolytes, how these ions, like chlorine, sodium, calcium, move in and out of our cells and participate in really important functions that allow us to live and operate normally. Now, this is a calcium channel blocker. So let's zoom in here. If something inhibits this channel, what happens is you will stop calcium from entering. So you see calcium coming in here. When you stop calcium from entering, you reduce the amount of neurotransmitters released, the amount of these molecules that help transmit these signals, in this case, pain signal. If you reduce the amount of neurotransmitters, then it results in analgesia or pain relief. Again, it's important to note that this is a non-opioid pathway. It's really, really pertinent to develop medications that don't use opioid pathways because they can provide all kinds of benefit without the drawbacks of addiction and things like that. So let's talk about some of the pros and cons. This drug is interesting, so let's get into that. Okay, so Ziconotide. First of all, this structure is beautiful. If you look at the black, think about that being in the foreground and the gray is in the background. It's a simple peptide. I know it looks complicated. It has a 3D structure. It's very, very interesting. So there's a lot of pros and cons to this medication. Let's look into it. So pros, like I keep saying, I know I keep saying it, but it uses a non-opioid pathway. That's just really important because non-opioid pathway drugs can really open up the door for a lot of really efficient pain management. It's effective at pain reduction. It's very potent, 1,000 times more potent than morphine, which means it's way more potent than fentanyl. And it avoids the mu receptor. In my fentanyl video, I talked about how that molecule and other opioids bind to this certain type of receptor. And we spoke about how this molecule is an N-type calcium channel agonist. We talked about how the flow of calcium affects that pain message, and it has a low potential for addiction. Now let's get into the cons. Now this is an FDA-approved medication, but it's one of those last resort medications. If nothing else works and the pain is severe enough, this could work. Now there's a lot of side effects. My next slide is going to be completely devoted to all the diverse side effects. Now the issue is twofold. One, if it has to be used, it's very, very expensive. The drug itself is expensive, but also you have to have it delivered through what's called intrathecal delivery. which is via the spinal cord. You have this device implanted that feeds directly into the spinal cord, getting that medication to where it needs to go. But again, this costs a lot of money. It's a little bit risky at times, and it's just inconvenient. So that's one of the main drawbacks for Ziconotide. It's expensive, it's inconvenient. And then we're going to talk about these side effects, because there's a lot of them. And this is another reason why it's not the most ideal medication. So we've all seen those pharmaceutical commercials where at the last few seconds, they give you all of those side effects. This is what I thought about when I looked into this drug. The paper kind of talks about this. So I mean, dizziness, nausea, confusion, involuntary eye movement, loss of strength, urinary retention means you can't urinate. Now, I'm not going to list all these, but the specific ones I do want to list that are important are auditory and visual hallucinations, thoughts of suicide, new or worsening depression, amnesia, paranoia. The psychological side effects are very evident. Now, some of these are more common than others, but some of the psychological side effects are highlighted because those are pretty intense. When it comes to this drug, there's a lot of potential for it. There's a lot. It does a lot of cool, useful things, but there's a lot of downside. It's expensive, a lot of crazy, nasty side effects. It's really inconvenient to deliver. So there's a lot of research that has to be done to really improve these substances and obtain more substances. But there's a lot of promise when it comes to these types of drugs. Let's get into the summary and talk about what we learned about today. So we talked about what cone snails are, these venomous sea snails found in tropical seas, thousands of different species, all kinds of colors, sizes, shapes, and they have this barb used to immobilize their prey, which they squirt venom out of. We talked about how these animals are carnivorous and some of them are even deadly to humans. Then we spoke about this diverse range of peptides they have called conotoxins that have these disulfide bonds, and there are hundreds to thousands of them in each snail, most of which are not even known. We spoke about the potentials of conotoxins, the ideal pain reliever that would reduce pain while allowing for cognitive function and just function in general. Spoke about Ziconotide, conotoxin G, some of these right here, with the whole focus being that these are non-opioid pathways, which are really important in the future of pain management. Then we got into conotoxin G and neurotensin being this natural molecule that we have that acts in our pain receptors and pain messaging. And conotoxin G, is a molecule that's been synthesized from the Conus geographus cone snail that acts similar to neurotensin in its effects. Then we spoke about Ziconotide, this N-type calcium channel blocker. It stops calcium from moving into these nerves and eventually reduces pain. Then we got into the pros and cons of this drug. It's very effective at reducing pain management. It's non-opioid, but there's a lot of nasty side effects. And it's a last resort medication. You have to deliver it via the spine. It costs a lot of money, and it's just kind of inconvenient in some ways to use. And then lastly, we spoke about the wide variety of side effects, specifically psychological side effects that can be very evident as this drug is used. But overall, I think what's important to note is that while there's still a lot of research that needs to be done, and while these molecules do have a lot of potential, there's a lot of downside. What's nice is that there is a treasure trove of peptides to discover and to use and to synthesize, because there's no shortage of sea snails and there's a lot of research to be done and a lot of questions to be answered. But I do think that this area of drug discovery has a lot of upside, and I think over time we will get to a place where there are many non-opioid medications that can be used for pain relief. So that's all I got. I learned a lot. I thought this was a very, very interesting topic. I hope you guys learned something new. As always, thank you so much for watching and listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell your friends, and I'll be back soon with another video.